Today's Ancient DOS game is one that's very well known by DOS gamers and has been a top request for a while now, and that game is Jill of the Jungle. Now, let's get this out of the way right now. I'm not actually a fan of this game, but I know a ton of people are, and since I don't have a lot to say about this one, and since I know my more unpopular opinions can sometimes come across as uninformed or insensitive, I think the smart thing to do this time around is to actually do more than just review this game, but actually go over the process I use for figuring out how good or bad these old games are. See, something that happens with old software, or old anything really, is nostalgia. Nostalgia is the reason most of you watch this show, and it's a big factor in people collecting old games and gaming hardware and peripherals and all those things. But nostalgia is not an indicator as to the quality of something. In fact, our nostalgia for things can sometimes blind us to the actual quality of the thing in question. So overcoming nostalgic feelings is a huge part of going back to these old games and talking about them objectively. But that can also potentially lead to making unfair comparisons. These old games were dealing with far different technical limitations, as well as a different sort of knowledge base to work from in terms of how games should be made or how games could be made. Being objective about an old game not only means being able to analyze its quality, but being able to analyze its quality from the perspective of someone who would have been exposed to that game when it was brand new. And that can be surprisingly difficult to do, especially in the case of a bad game that you've mastered, as games are often bad for reasons which can be adapted to with enough practice, thus making the game easier and more enjoyable to play over time, despite still technically being a bad game. So my plan for today is to pick apart the various aspects of Jill of the Jungle and explain why I consider them good or bad or average, and sort of do it in a step-by-step format, since oftentimes I just give simple generalizations which are easier to understand, but don't always completely convey my thoughts. Or sometimes they'll explain what makes something good or bad without elaborating on why those things should be considered good or bad. These are all factors that I personally can improve upon, but I can at least give you all an idea of how this process goes. Jill of the Jungle was created and released by Epic MegaGames in 1992, and it's a one-player platforming game. It supports CGA 4 color, EGA 16 color, and VGA 256 color graphics, all running at 320 by 200 resolution. Though given how the VGA support works, I wouldn't be surprised if it worked on MCGA hardware as well, despite being touted strictly as VGA. In terms of audio, it officially supports the PC speaker for sound effects, or Sound Blaster cards for both sound effects and music. Though my testing showed that the music might work with ad-lib cards, which, given that it's done through OPL2, you'd think it'd be a no-brainer. But the music in this game makes use of Creative Labs' special FM synth drivers, and I'm not entirely certain if that combination would work with real hardware or not. As for its current release date, it's still commercial but never saw a modern digital release, so the only legitimate way to obtain the game is to buy an old secondhand copy. Now, this is a point of contention some people have, is that, so what if the copyrights are still in place? If the game isn't being sold anywhere and finding copies is extremely difficult, there should be nothing wrong with obtaining quote-unquote abandonware copies, since how else would anyone ever be able to play the game? Well, I want to state for the record that I completely understand this frustration, and I hope that in the future, someone comes up with better copyright laws which makes this kind of preservation and enjoyment of old software legal. But at the moment, that's not how it works, and it'd be irresponsible of me to advocate presently illegal acts as a means of obtaining or using software, even though I really don't have a problem with most other people's opinions on this. Though I will say I've heard some pretty dumb ones, such as that copyright should expire after just 5 years, or that it should be illegal for the creator of something to continue to profit off of their work after 10 years or so. But as for obtaining this game, that's where things get tricky. Finding the complete trilogy version of Jill is extraordinarily difficult, with the prices often reaching the high double digits or even triple digits. In fact, even the individual episodes in box can run for excessive amounts, including the shareware episode. So trying to collect all 3 episodes of the game individually can be expensive, time-consuming, and hard. This is one of those circumstances where legal copies of the game are pretty much relegated to hardcore collectors only, which is why I wasn't able to get it on my own accord in over 200 episodes, and why I wanted to clarify my stance on the whole abandonware thing. Now, the story is often not a huge factor in how I judge a game because decent stories and terrible stories have been a part of all forms of entertainment since the beginning of time pretty much. But when understanding the story can help make a game better, I like to give a rundown of what's going on to help give some context to what everyone watching is seeing on screen. In the case of Jill of the Jungle, the story is told in 3 episodes, with each episode sort of being its own self-contained story. However, each story is extraordinarily brief. In the first game, Jill is simply adventuring through the jungle, no particular reason given, though she finds a strange mushroom forest at the end. The second game picks up from there, and has Jill adventuring through an underground labyrinth trying to find her way out. The third game then picks up from there, where she suddenly learns that there's a particular prince that's been kidnapped, and that if she doesn't save him, the forests and jungles are going to be bulldozed away to build condos. So yeah, Jill's story is about as paper thin as it gets without completely tearing apart. Even Doom had more of a story than these games. But that's not a strike against the game really, as there's plenty of great games with little or no story. If the game relied on its story to drive the gameplay, then it would be an issue. But that's usually more of a consideration for RPGs and strategy games than for platformers. The gameplay in Jill of the Jungle will seem very familiar if you've ever played Zargon, as Zargon's actually a spiritual successor to Jill of the Jungle. There are some differences though. For instance, Jill doesn't have any means of attack by default, instead collecting knives and blades. The knives function like boomerangs in that they're thrown forwards distance, then come back after a moment. Now if you're unable to recollect one of your thrown knives, it just gently falls to the ground and you can collect it later. Blades, on the other hand, bounce around when they're thrown, and they don't need to be recovered, even though you technically can. The trick is that you can only have one blade in the air at a time for each ones you've collected, and they can take a moment to disappear on their own. Now if you have both blades and knives available, the knives will only get thrown if you have all of your blades in the air. Other features similar to Zargon is being able to transform into different animals with different powers, being able to collect keys to unlock doors, and fruit to regain health. Plus the map system in Zargon is also present in Jill, but only in the 3rd episode, while the 1st episode has a hub level, and the 2nd episode is just a linear run through the levels. Now, the gameplay is almost certainly the most important part of any gaming experience, and unless I have anything specific to elaborate on about the gameplay, I often just group all of the gameplay elements together. I generally want to talk about things in some kind of order, making sure each aspect that I talk about flows into one another to make them easier to touch on. The other thing I have to consider too is the age of the game, as this can affect what limitations there would be in terms of making a certain style of gameplay work. I also have to consider what other kinds of games would have been out there with comparable features. Jill of the Jungle features a half-tile movement system, where everything is moved in half-tile increments, with the frame rate locked at 18.2 frames per second, which is a common thing to do as this is the same rate that the IRQ0 timer interrupt runs at by default in DOS. This lower frame rate makes it easier to render everything necessary without the frame rate dropping, since you have more time to render stuff in, which in turn also allows the game to run on lower end systems that might have been standard at the time. In this case, with Jill being released in '92, a typical computer would have been running between 12 and 33 MHz, although 66 MHz systems were just coming out onto the market. Well, generally when I look at the gameplay of a game, I investigate the mechanics. Do the mechanics work the way the player would expect them to? And if not, why not? And is the problem systemic of the kind of programming done at the time, an oversight by the developers, or a result of just being rushed out the door? In the case of Jill of the Jungle, most of the mechanics of the game work well enough, but there are definitely some oversights. For instance, there's a kind of red devil enemy found in some of the levels, possibly in reference to ghosts and goblins, since just like the red devils in that game, the ones here take an excessive number of hits to kill and are by far the most difficult enemies to deal with compared to every other kind of enemy in the game. That, in and of itself, is not a problem, but the sheer quantity of these enemies in later levels can grind progression down to a halt from an otherwise steady pace. But then, this is why it's important to play as far as you can when you're taking a critical approach to a game, because sometimes what may seem like an oversight or bug might actually be intentional. There's a thing with these games where you'll drown if you touch water, but only if it's a surface water tile. Water tiles used to represent falling water or underwater have no effect. This may seem glitchy and weird, but there are parts of the third episode where taking advantage of this quirk is necessary to progress, even with arrows pointing out that yes, you're not crazy, you're supposed to do that. The game does have some actual bugs though. For instance, in the version I was playing, version 1.2D, which was the last version released, changes caused by switches are not immediately rendered to the screen and can in fact appear fragmented if you pass through such areas with Jill's sprite. Now, this is not apparent in earlier versions of the game, such as the 1.2B version, which I also have since it came on the same disc, but I didn't realize what was going on until I was already about halfway through recording footage. Actually, the versioning is a bit of a mess, and I'll go into it a little later on when it's more relevant. Now, collision detection in this game is kind of quirky in that you take more damage the more separate times you touch something, with a handful of exceptions just eat into your health continually. As a result of this, sometimes the best way to get past an enemy is to just take a hit and move on by. There's apples that can restore your health, but these can be permanently lost if the game thinks you're in a checkpoint state. And that too leads into something really quirky, in that if the game doesn't think you've hit a checkpoint, dying will reset the state of the stage. Otherwise, you simply respawn at the last checkpoint you reached without resetting anything. But some stages start you off in a checkpoint state, meaning if you die, you respawn at the start without resetting the rest of the stage. All of this culminates into a gameplay experience which works well, but has unusual quirks which can take some effort to get used to. So because of that, I can't really use the gameplay of this game alone to formulate an overall opinion. I need more to go on. If the controls in a game have no issues, I generally don't give them their own section to talk about them. But here in Jill of the Jungle, I definitely need to address them separately, so I can talk about two flaws they have in this game and why I consider them flaws. But first, you have to understand a bit about how keyboards work on a DOS PC. You see, computers have what's referred to as I/O ports, essentially a means for the CPU to communicate with many other parts of the system, with a few exceptions, such as RAM, which is addressed in its own way. The keyboard was only afforded a single 8-bit I/O port on old DOS systems, meaning only 8 bits of data could be received from the keyboard in any moment. Now, given that a typical keyboard has around 100 keys, this makes it impractical to track the state of every single key all at once, since it would have to be done with a massive shift register. Instead, keyboards output a constant stream of a 1-bit flag indicating whether the last state change was a key being pressed down or released, and a 7-bit value to indicate which key last had a state change. From here, it's now up to the BIOS to determine how to interpret this data. But the BIOS method is suited specifically for typing. For games where you want to hold down keys, and especially when you want to hold down more than one key at a time, the BIOS method is insufficient, meaning the programmer has to write their own keyboard handler, essentially intercepting the keyboard I/O and interpreting it in a more desirable way. Improperly developed keyboard handlers are often the cause of bad controls in early DOS games. Jill of the Jungle is not one of them, but Jill of the Jungle still does suffer from control issues. In this case, the problem is twofold. The first is that Jill suffers from a single frame delay in the controls. Now, if the game ran at 60 frames a second, the vast majority of players wouldn't notice this. However, as previously stated, the game runs at 18.2 frames per second, so a single frame delay is actually just over a 20th of a second, which is pretty substantial and will be noticed by a number of players. Now, the reason delays like this occur has to do with how the input is written to coincide with game logic and rendering. Basically, during the time between 2 frames, you want to handle input, then process that input through your game logic before rendering the next frame. However, it is very possible to screw this up. For instance, processing the logic after rendering the current frame, but before the wait for the next frame when you'd be capturing input, in which case you'd almost certainly end up with a single frame of input lag. The other problem Jill of the Jungle's controls suffer from ties in with its half-tile increments, and a feature of the animation where Jill requires a single frame to start running from a standstill. That alone means that there's technically a 2-frame delay to go from standing still to running, but on top of that, it means that if you're trying to edge yourself forwards for making a precise jump, you either have to do it while airborne where there's no additional delay in moving left or right, or magically time out holding the arrow key for 2 frames but not 3, while taking the input lag into account since it will run 1 extra frame more than you hold the key for. This is extraordinarily difficult to do, meaning if you want to edge up to a ledge, it's safer to jump first and do the edging while you're airborne. So yeah, the controls in Jill of the Jungle aren't bad, but they have flaws which detract from the playability and responsiveness. So that now puts the game into below average territory, but we're far from done. I'm going to be particularly harsh on the graphics for Jill of the Jungle, even though there's technically nothing wrong with them and I don't have any strikes to give against them. The reason why I'm going to be harsh though is because they were actually being promoted to be better than the graphics found in Super Nintendo games. To which I would say, go play Super Mario World, come back and play this, then tell me that with a straight face that Jill's graphics are better. But that's just generalizing, so let me explain 2 things going on which makes this comparison highly dubious. First of all, part of the logic behind this reasoning was simply because of the colors. Game consoles are built very differently from a PC, and often relied on a hardware-accelerated sprite system of some sort, which often wasn't able to address every possible color in a single sprite. However, because of how PC games worked, a PC game engine could have as many colors as possible for the video mode being used in any of the graphics that it wanted. So using all 256 VGA palette entries available in a single sprite or map tile or whatnot was totally doable. Unfortunately, this led to a somewhat questionable practice of overusing gradient fills in PC games to make things look quote-unquote better, and Jill was no exception to this practice. And truth be told, sometimes less is more. And just take a super close look at the graphics of some of your favorite SNES games, and you might be surprised at just how few colors are being used. The other issue too is that Jill of the Jungle does a very bad job of masking its tile boundaries. Now don't get me wrong, this doesn't make the graphics bad, but it does make them less polished than most Super Nintendo games. Not to mention the lack of parallax scrolling or a full screen camera. Like, those are things the Super Nintendo could do very easily. As for the sound and music, well, this is where things get complicated. You see, Jill of the Jungle had 6 version releases. Version 1.0, version 1.2, version 1.2, version 1.2, version 1.2, and version 1.2. Yeah, officially, there's a version 1.0 and 5 version 1.2s, which fans have designated as plain 1.2 and then 1.2a, b, c, and d, identified by CRCs and file sizes primarily, as the file dates are often unreliable due to how the installer for this game works. Now, the disc I was given contains 1.2b and 1.2d, which I believe is one of the more common discs out there. Now, the reason for all of these versions were mainly due to attempts to make the sound system more compatible with the many variants of Sound Blaster cards being released, not to mention the clone cards that were coming out, as well as taking into account the massive boosts and speeds that computers were seeing in the early 90s. Now, all of that said, neither version 1.2b or d are perfect. And I already mentioned how there was a graphical glitch introduced in 1.2d, but the reason I chose to go with D in capturing game footage originally was because it had the most balanced sound and music. All other versions have much louder sound effects compared to the music when emulated, and some versions don't even play back the sound or music when emulated, or run into speed issues, and these things can even happen on real hardware. Now, you can control exactly which version is being run by running the appropriate executable directly, but if you run the launcher in the combo version disk, it automatically chooses which version to run based on certain detections which try to determine what kind of sound card you have. As 1.2d is more compatible overall, but sounds less accurate and has more of an interpolation thing going on compared to B. All of that said, Jill of the Jungle does have a unique kind of sound test called the Noisemaker, where you just press keyboard keys and various sound effects from the game will be played. Also, the sounds are completely different between all 3 episodes, with even jump sounds and attack sounds being changed, which can be kind of weird at first, but you do kind of get used to it too, sorta. I don't know. I rarely touch on graphics and sound directly unless there's technical issues with them, as everything else can often be just a matter of perspective. So despite everything I've just said, I would still consider the graphics and sound in this game to be about average, maybe a little more. There's one last thing to mention about the sound though, in that this is another of many PC games out there which could only play one sound effect at a time. See, early Sound Blaster cards didn't do hardware mixing of digital effects. You'd feed them a buffer of data through direct memory access and tell them to just play that. And if you wanted to play multiple sound effects at a time, you had to mix them yourself, which burned precious CPU power and could actually slow the game down depending on how many sound channels you were emulating. This is partly why the Gravis Ultrasound made such a huge impact, is because it took the necessity to do this away from the programmer, allowing the programmer to just load their samples onto the card and just say, play this sample, and it would play it and mix it with whatever other samples were being played. This isn't an excuse for lacking proper digitized sound mixing, but it explains why so many DOS games would only play just a single sound effect at a time, as either the devs didn't have time to write their own mixer, couldn't afford a third-party mixer, couldn't write one that just worked fast enough to not slow their game down, or just didn't want to go through the trouble figuring a single sound channel would be fine. Lastly, let's talk about level design, as this doesn't come up often either. Being able to make good levels with good progression and difficulty is a surprisingly challenging thing to do. Now, Jill of the Jungle handles progression decently in the first episode, kinda worse in the second episode, but not really that bad, but it handles it really badly in the third episode. In the first episode, the player is given new obstacles to overcome in increments, never being overwhelmed too greatly, but having a decent array of challenges all the same. In the second episode, the player is shown some new stuff right off the bat, but a lot of it just never comes up again throughout the rest of the episode, recycling a lot of content from the first episode and just making the levels more challenging in the process. Now, the challenge never gets unfair, but does result in a solid number of deaths, especially once Red Devils start to get involved. Unfortunately, the game gives you unlimited lives, which is actually quite a fair foresight given the change in tone from arcade gaming to home gaming and how so many games were still using extra live systems at the time. However, the third episode just goes nuts and feels more like a ROM hack than a legitimate third episode. And part of the reason for this is that there are no checkpoints anywhere in the third episode. Technically. Every level has a starting checkpoint, so if you die, you return to the start with your progress through the level maintained. However, there's some incredibly evil levels here, where you'll just end up having to do precision jumping for a full minute just to get back to where you were, and then hope you have enough health left to get just a little further, inching along slowly but surely. I actually wasn't able to finish the third episode because I got stuck in the 12th level just constantly having to redo most of the level over and over and over again due to simple mistakes and an extreme overuse of instant death spikes. This is why the third episode feels more like a ROM hack than a legitimate challenge. It's just too easy to die, and you constantly go back to the start of every level. This is the point in time when I formulate my overall thoughts on a game and present recommendations as to who should play it and who shouldn't. Because quite frankly, numerical scores are garbage. Some of my most favorite games only ever got like 5 or 6 out of 10, while some games I don't like at all are some of the most beloved titles out there, like Chrono Trigger or XCOM, or Jill of the Jungle. I don't like this game because of the technical issues, the insane difficulty in the third episode, and the attempts made to promote this thing to be more graphically and audibly stupendous than it actually is. Now, this isn't to say the game is bad, as is evidenced by how highly requested this game is, or there's a lot of people who love this thing. But it's not specifically because of the gameplay, nor the graphics, nor the level design, controls, sound, music, any of that. It's because of how it makes the player feel when playing it. Jill of the Jungle, despite its shortcomings, is incredibly unique. Not just when it came out, but also this far into the future. Even when compared to Zargon, it does not have the same feel or sound or look or any of that. Unique games stand the test of time the best, regardless of how good or bad they are, and people are also more likely to be lenient with them just from the fact that they're playing something which provides an experience which can't easily be replicated with anything else. So, with all of that said, do I recommend hunting down a copy of this game and playing it? Again, there's no numerical answer to this because it depends on who you are. I would say that if you enjoy platforming games, then it's worth at least giving the shareware version a try before making a decision to track down registered copies of the second and third episodes, since even as a platformer fan, you're going to need to gauge for yourself if this game is worth your time or not. But due to how inaccessible the games become and due to its quirks, it's better suited for someone who specifically enjoys the genre. So for others who don't like platformers or only enjoy a small number of them, this game probably won't offer an experience they would enjoy. But then, these are ultimately just generalizations. Really, I am but a guide. It's up to you, the viewer, to decide how much you agree or disagree with me, and to make your retro purchasing and gaming decisions accordingly. As for setting this game up in DOSBox, you need to set a fixed cycles count. Auto and max do work, but often break the Sound Blaster sound support, and even when they don't, the speed won't be consistent. I recommend a setting of around 8,000 cycles. Other than that, you should be good to go. The game does have joystick support, but I recommend skipping on it due to how accurate you have to be with some of the platforming that you need to accomplish. Anywho, that's all for this episode of Ancient DOS Games. Hopefully with this new insight into how I go about talking about these old games, you'll have a better understanding of how not just I, but other retro game reviewers take approaches to revisiting this old stuff. Talking about the quality of retro games, or even just sitting down and listening to someone talking about them, can be difficult when nostalgia often clouds our views. So I just want to do the best I can to ensure I'm giving you all solid information. Since I do indeed make mistakes from time to time, and sometimes have to retract things or add corrections to make up for that, I'm human, it happens. In any case, next Saturday will be episode 207, and since we had a bit of a Super Nintendo comparison thing going on today, let's do another one. So yes, I'll be covering a game that saw both a PC and SNES release. Now, there's actually a lot of games that could be, so to narrow it down even further, it did not come out for any other systems at the time, just those two. Now, if you think you know of a game like that, then be sure to send your guess to adg@pixelships.com, and stay tuned because this next one's probably going to come as a surprise to some of you. Thanks for watching, everyone, and special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's a small random set of you guys.